I would like to talk to you about the economic future of the country, because I remain convinced, as I was convinced of this in World War II. I was convinced of it during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 9/11, the financial crisis, that nothing could basically stop America. And we've faced great problems in the past. We haven't faced this exact problem. In fact, we haven't really faced anything that even quite resembles this problem. But we faced tougher problems, and the American miracle, the American magic, has always prevailed, and it will do so again. And I would like to take you through a little history to essentially make my case that if you were to pick one time to be born and one place to be born, and you didn't know what your sex was going to be, you didn't know what your intelligence would be, you didn't know what your special talents or special deficiencies would be, that if you could do that one time, you would not pick 1720, you would not pick 1820, you would not pick 1920. You'd pick today, and you would pick America. And of course, the interesting thing about it is that ever since America was organized in 1789, when George Washington took the oath of office, people have wanted to come here. Can you imagine that? For 231 years, there's always been people that have wanted to come here. Now, my friend, I think has jumped the gun just a shade on putting up slide one, but I'm going to call from some slides as we go along. But the interesting thing about this country is what is on slide one. Let's put it up. And this is an extraordinarily young country. Now, I'm comparing it to a couple of guys that are pretty old, but when you think about the fact that my age, Charlie's age, or our life experience, and then we'll throw in this young guy over here, Greg Abel, and if our life experiences combined exceed the life of the United States, we are a very, very young country. But what we've accomplished is miraculous. Now, just think of this little spot in history. And if we'll go to slide 2, I've tried to estimate. Well, let's go back and we stay with slide 2. But the population in 1790, we had 3.9 million people here. Incidentally, when you look up census figures, you find out that they had a big fire in the Department of Commerce building in 1921, so they lost a lot of the census records. So these are not quite as there's some things where there's a few gaps, but there were 3.9 million people in the United States, and actually, I've got 0.6 million. It's closer to 0.7 million. There were 700,000 of those people were slaves at the time. But those 3.9 million people were 1/2 of 1% of the population of the planet. And if you'd asked any of those 3.9 million people, any of them, to imagine what life would be like 231 years later, even the most optimistic person, and they could have been drinking heavily and even had a little pot, and they still could not in their wildest dreams have thought that in 3 lifetimes, Charlie's, mine, and Greg's, that in that period, you would be looking at a country with 280 million vehicles shuffling around its roads. Airplanes, maybe not today so much, but they'll be back again. And they're flying people at 40,000 feet, coast to coast in 5 hours. That great universities would exist in one state after another, great hospital systems, and entertainment would be delivered to people in a way nobody could have dreamt of in 1790s. This country, in 231 years, has exceeded anybody's dreams. I went to the internet trying to prepare for this, and I tried, if you'll move to the next slide, I tried to find out what was the wealth of the country in 1789, our starting point. And I punched in United States wealth. I tried 1789, I tried 1790. I thought it might be a little easier in terms of a round year. And I think 4 million or so references came up. And I didn't look at all 4 million, but I can tell you the data collection in those early days on many fronts was not anything like today. You really can't find what I would consider reliable figures. You can find out how many mules there were in the country and a few things like that, and trying to add them up. But in real estate, when you're looking at houses or apartment houses or office buildings, that they're each slightly different than each other, but they look to comparable sales. So it's hard to find a lot of countries that have been sold where the wealth has been estimated. But it was interesting to go back and think about the fact that in 1803, we purchased for $15 million. We made the Louisiana Purchase. Now that's a little later than 1789, but that's the best comp, as they say in real estate. That's the best comp we could find for land mass anyway. And when we made that purchase, that was equal, incidentally, to about a quarter, about 800,000 plus square miles. But it was about a quarter of what the lower 48 states now contain. So we bought about a quarter of the lower 48 for this $15 million back in 1803. And if you live in Texas and your grandfather is close to dying, and he calls the children around him, and in his final words, he always says, "Don't sell the mineral rights." Well, the French sold us the mineral rights on that $15 million deal as well. So we got that whole strip there. We got all of Kansas and essentially all of Oklahoma, and they produced 21 billion barrels of oil for us and a lot of natural gas since the purchase. One of the sidelights is that we paid our $15 million for the Louisiana Purchase. We paid $3 million of it, 20% of it. We paid with 200,000 ounces of gold valued at $15 an ounce, and that $3 million that the French took. And we got South Dakota as part of the Louisiana Purchase, and the Home State mine up there, before it closed, produced well over 40 million ounces of gold. and 40 million ounces of gold. And comes to about $60 billion worth. And like I say, 200,000 ounces took care of 20% of our purchase price. So the Louisiana purchase was a bargain, but it's what the going price was for 800,000 square miles, I guess, at the time, and 3 cents an acre. And so I decided, by playing around with various numbers such as that it, as a reasonable estimate of the worth of the country in 1789, $1 billion was not a crazy figure. Now, if I'd been an academician or something, I would have put $1,107,400,000 or something like that. Or I would have made it look respectable. But it's a wild guess. But it's not a crazy figure. So what has happened? Let's move on to the next slide. To the wealth of the country since then. And here we have some figures that come out pretty regularly. Well, they do come out regularly, where the Federal Reserve estimates the net household worth of people in the United States, all the households in the United States. And you can look these up, and you'll see that there's 30 trillion of stocks, and I think maybe single-family homes. There's 82 million or so owner-occupied single families, and maybe 45 million rental apartments and so on. So you start adding all these up, and the Federal Reserve tells us, and I invite you to look at the data, it's kind of interesting, that we now, in the United States, 231 years later, we have 100 trillion. We have more than 100 trillion of household wealth, even though the stock market's gone down somewhat since the last quarterly report. So you say, well, we've had a lot of inflation and everything. We actually, in the United States, for the first half of our existence, roughly, we didn't really have that much inflation. We had inflationary periods and deflationary periods, but the general price level did not change that dramatically. But I will assume again for this calculation that there's been 20-for-1 inflation. It's way less than that in many commodities, but it's very hard to measure and talk about equivalent benefits from different kinds of products and so on, and costs. But I think it's reasonable to say that the United States, in real terms, has increased in wealth. That's something in the area of 5,000 for one, which is really, it's mind-blowing. 5,000 for one in real terms in a country that had 0.5% had a bunch of raw land. But a vision that to accomplish that in 231 years, there's just no denying that's beyond what anybody could have dreamt earlier. But it was not done, and this is important, because we've now hit a bump in the road. It was not done without some very, very serious bumps in the road. It was not 231 years of steady progress. As a matter of fact, we had been in this birth of this country, we'd been, into it 72 years, and if we go to the next slide, 1861, we now had about 31 million people. With the 1960 census showed around 31 million people or thereabouts in the country, and 4 million of them were slaves, and we had never really resolved the very much unfinished business of what was involved in compromises in 1789, and we'll have more to say about that later. But we had something that not too many countries experience, and if you told people in 1789 that in 72 years you were going to have a division that caused the President of the United States at Gettysburg to say that testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and dedicated can long endure. Imagine the President of the United States wondering aloud whether the country that he was presiding over could long endure. Only 72 years, or 74 years at Gettysburg, had taken place. So while this marvelous dream was being played out, roughly a third of the way through it, we faced this really moment of decision, and we entered into a contest that, if we'll go to the next slide, we made an estimate that literally killed roughly 6% of the males in the country who were between 18 and 60. I'm assuming that there were more than 600,000 deaths in the war, and I think it's a reasonable estimate that 18 to 60 group was males were by far the great proportion. So imagine 6% of your working prime age males in a country are wiped out in 4 years. So when we look at the progress of this country and we think of our own problems now, I just ask you to ponder, and we'll move to the next slide. That would be equivalent today to having 4 billion males in that same age group similarly wiped out. So that was one incredible interruption which this country nevertheless worked through while compiling this American dream that is one of the wonders of the world, perhaps the wonder of the world in many senses. So let's move on to another crisis of a different sort that hit the country. And this, of course, is the 1929 crash, which led to the Great Depression. And here, the Dow Jones average, which we'll use through this, at that time, that's the one everybody paid attention to. Actually, the second most important average at that time, if you look at the papers, was the New York Times average, which has disappeared. And of course, the Standard & Poor's has probably regarded as a superior yardstick. But the Dow Jones is a perfectly adequate yardstick. And on September 3rd, 1929, the Dow Jones average closed at 381.17, and people were very happy, and buying stocks on margin had worked wonderfully. And the Roaring '20s had a good feeling to it with the auto coming of age and the day of air travel coming along and all kinds of new appliances and the telephone getting wider use, believe it or not. It hadn't really caught on that much prior thereto, but the movies were coming on. It was a happy place. And then, of course, if we'll move to the next slide, we'll look at what happened in the couple of months after September 3rd. And the Dow Jones average almost got cut in half. And that was pretty impressive until we had this recent situation where in a shorter period of time, we lost about a third. But the crash, and there's a great book about it called The Great Crash by John Kenneth Galbraith. Let me interject one little plug here. There's a small business in Omaha. I hate what truncating this meeting or changing it so dramatically has done to many of the businesses in Omaha, because I think small businesses were the beneficiaries of a really they got a lot of business for the Berkshire meeting, and they're going to get it in the future. But they suffered during a period like this, and they just had a story about the bookworm. Well, the bookworm, if you buy any books that come out of anything I recommend, think about just put in bookworm in Omaha, and The Great Crash is a wonderful book.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.